Cheers, guys. Epix911, welcome to the Elitist Geek VR news for Monday, December 19th, 2016. Let's jump right into VR, guys. It is also the first official day of my vacation. Chillaxation is slowly kicking in. Always takes my body a while, but we're going to get there. I promise you guys. Try to remember to mention at the end of the video the delay for the two games that I mentioned I was going to have up yesterday. And of course, I do the usual IT guide time estimates, which are always horribly off. But with that said, let's jump right in. G2A. Now, these guys have primarily been known for one thing. And that one thing is reselling secondhand Steam keys. Now, apparently, they are absolutely serious about developing virtual reality games. Their first game is a first-person shooter called Blunt Force, which is going to be released initially on the Oculus Rift. They're hoping to bring it to other platforms after. Like I said, first-person shooter. It's going to be episodic, so they're going to release, different episodes of it, and it's going to be taking place primarily in two different time periods. The years just before World War II, so kind of the mid-30s to late 30s, and then the years during World War II, 1939 to 1945. The visuals look pretty damn good. So if the gameplay matches the visuals, we should be in for a decent game indeed. Next up, Thumper. That's a rail/rhythm title that I really enjoyed on the PlayStation VR. Still play it from time to time. Is now playable and available on Oculus Rift and HTC Vive. Didn't have an opportunity to check out the price, but I do believe as of today they are both up, so Oculus Store and the Steam Store. Next, the Oculus Touch game, The Unspoken, which has been getting really good reviews all over the internet. It's a touch-specific game. It's the one where you use hand gestures for spellcasting and such, and you play spellcasting-style characters. They've announced that throughout 2017, they being Insomniac Games, they're going to release, they haven't mentioned if it's DLC paid content or free, but new spells, modes, and quote-unquote other features. So if that's a game you've been enjoying, The Unspoken, there's more coming at you in 2017. Now let's talk about probably my favorite news piece of 2016, because of what it represents. And what it represents is VR freedom. Freedom from having your HMD tethered. And I'm talking about TPCAST and their wireless VR kit. Talked about these guys twice, two separate news stories. And both of those times, other than a kind of a little bit of a secretive testing, nothing's really been substantiated or had a second mainstream opinion until this article. UploadVR has gotten their hands on a TPCAST unit. There's two versions of the kit that they're going to be selling, a 3-hour battery version and a 5-hour battery version. Now, they tried out the more robust 5-hour battery version, completely drained it, got the 5 hours of testing in. So a pretty good idea of what this thing is capable of. So let's get into the setup and configuration aspects. So they used the business edition of the HT Vive. So all intent and purpose, it's roughly the same as our consumer level HMD as far as the HMD is concerned. Now, they also state with regards to the video transmitter that ideally it needs to be placed overhead roughly about midway in your playfield. And it's capable of supporting an area 5 by 5 meters. So that's roughly 15 by 15 feet. And the reason for putting it overhead is to basically provide the best experience. Now, remember, this is a 60 gigahertz technology, Wi-Fi technology. It requires pretty much line of sight with no obstructions. And I remember when I talked about this the last time, a couple of you actually mentioned it's likely going to be installed directly overhead. Bang on. You guys were literally bang on. That's where it needs to be. Now, the claim, like I said, is 5 by 5 meters. The battery pack basically goes into a back pocket or I guess you could put it into a fanny pack if that's your bag. And a thin cable then runs up to the HMD, so to your Vive HMD. Now, I mentioned that there's two versions of this. Even with that thin wire, the reviewer noted that it was much lighter than the tethered version. I don't suppose that's a huge surprise. Plus, you've got the bulk of the weight, which is the battery itself, down below, by kind of your waist level. So that's not going to factor into any additional weight. It's literally just the thin cable, which is awesome. Now, they ran the battery flat, as I mentioned, and they noticed absolutely no difference in motion to photon latency while sampling a variety of titles. And they did Google Earth VR, which really requires a pretty good low latency signal because of the zooming in and out that you do and keeping and maintaining resolution throughout that. Tilt Brush and Valve's The Lab, which has a bunch of different things to test in there. It would have been nice if they tried some more demanding games. That would have been really cool, like Raw Data, for example. How does that perform? Or an Elite Dangerous, where the latency is that much more important because of the higher resolution graphics. Now, they did notice artifacts from time to time, and it momentarily reminded them that they were indeed using a wireless headset. And it almost looked, the way they describe it, like compression artifacts. Now, I don't know how many of you had HD boxes when the technology first came out, but especially here in Western Canada, the compression was so bad compared to over-the-air HD, which was beautiful because it's pretty much non-compressed. The cable box solution just had a lot of artifacting, and it would drive me nuts watching my Canucks ice hockey games, and every few seconds you would just see these big nasty squares everywhere. It's nowhere near that bad what they're talking about. They're calling them minor artifacts that do momentarily remind you you're wireless, but do not bust or destroy the immersiveness of the experience. They also weren't able to repeat. That's why personally, I think it has more to do with the compression algorithm than any specific motion or movement, because that's how they went about trying to replicate it, and they couldn't. You got to check the video out, guys, because one of the guys that they had testing is a gymnast, and he plays the sword. Of course, I forget the title and don't write it in my notes, but that sword game for HTC Vive where you're basically sword fighting throughout, and it's a pretty damn good workout. Well, he takes that to a whole other level. He does basically a Bruce Lee backflip and then a forward thrust to the opponent. It looks right out of a martial arts movie. Freaking amazing. He did that several times, apparently. One of those times, the TPCAST cable portion fell off his Vive headset, but it looks pretty damn good. And you got to think, for a guy like him, he literally could turn that into a cardio workout. They also commented that it feels well under the 20 milliseconds that the company had advertised. That's a good thing, because that was a major concern of mine. And of course, like I mentioned, that it feels much lighter than the default Vive with its heavy tethered cable. Let's talk about the how the technology works. And they drilled the TPCAST CEO, Michael Liu, about that. And here's how he described it. He calls it a bidirectional communication portal that uses a compression algorithm described as the company's quote-unquote, this isn't my words, this is theirs, secret sauce, with wireless HD. And that's all they mentioned. Now, speculation from the team at UploadVR is that this is a 60 gigahertz Wi-Fi signal. If you look at the evidence, it would all seem to point in that direction, especially with the overhead mounting, which would be free of obstruction, which 60 gigahertz Wi-Fi requires. So very cool. And they believe it sends the 2160 by 1200 video data using that, proprietary algorithm. Input like head and hand movements, all transmitted via the router, which is an additional unit that comes with the kit. And so all in all, this thing sounds amazing. Can't wait to get my hands on this. Hope to hell Rift has something similar, and PlayStation VR. That would just be fantastic, because I think that's the next step that so many of us, well, let me clarify. Most of us in the room scale side of the equation want. I suppose if you're seated, it doesn't really matter as much. Unless I guess it's a seated game where you've got a swivel chair and you are swiveling around a lot. In a case like that, wireless would absolutely be beneficial. Next news piece, building plastic wooden models in VR using MONZO VR, which is a new application. Now, I've mentioned before, my parents' generation, kind of the baby boomers, and I know I talk about generations a lot, but I think it's important, especially within the context of a lot of this stuff, because it's historical, right? And sometimes you need to clarify things because people of different generations don't always know what those other decades were like firsthand, okay? But I can tell you, in the 80s, that's when things started turning around because my parents' generation absolutely did not wear their geek on their sleeve. It was, and I've said this before, turn the lights off, everybody's in bed, sneak downstairs, put your conductor's hat on, and go to choo-choo heaven. Not the case anymore. You can do that in the daytime. Hell, you can tell your colleagues and family about it without getting harshly criticized. Some may still screw them, right? It's what we like to do. And that was one of the questions that UploadVR had for the MONZO VR creators is the hands-on part, because part of building models is being able to show friends, family, look what I built, or hold what I built. You can't do that as easily in VR. You're handing them an HMD, right? But still very, very cool. There's ships in a bottle, the plastic and glue style models, cars that you can put together. And there's definitely some strengths. Just like I mentioned some cons, being able to rotate the models and scale them in ways that you couldn't do with a real life object, which I suppose was probably part of the fun for some people, especially when you're dealing with really small scales and you really require precision. You don't require that near as much in VR because you simply scale it up. But very cool. Check that out. If model hobbying is your thing, you can check that out. Next news piece has to do with VR art. Basically the pros and cons of this new VR art medium. I'm going to have some pictures while I'm yapping, different examples of VR art that people have created using medium, tilt brush, quill, etc. And talk about some of the pros. So one of the pros that they mention in the article is the sense of environment and presence that you get through these VR art programs. No longer is a scene something that you see in your head and transfer to a 2D canvas. No, you're in the canvas. Your scene is a real life virtual scene. It's as 3D as the real world is, which is awesome. It allows you to approach your art in a whole different way. Teleportation, being able to view your work from multiple perspectives without losing scale or having to rotate. That is just freaking awesome. And again, it's like what I talked about with the models, right? Guide, symmetry, and 2D drawing. Having the option of using a square, sphere, or capsule guide that will basically allow you to scale non-uniformly and then place it anywhere in your scene. Special effects brushes. Social aspects. Being able to have people enter the scene with you and work on the piece with you. Again, just fantastic. Now, obviously there's some cons. One of those cons is post-brush stroke editing. And most of these programs, you can't do that like you could in Photoshop. You also don't have access to layers because everything lives on one layer. You have depths, like you can scale down infinitely, like that piece that I talked about with the aliens on a planet, zoom in, snow globe, you zoom into that, and you finally go down the bunny hole or the rabbit hole. You got that, but you don't have your conventional Photoshop style layers, which is maybe big for some people and for a lot, probably not a huge deal. Also, a lack of opacity, and that's most noticeable when you're using stuff like the smoke brush technique, where you dab that smoke effect. If you do too much of that in any one spot, it basically turns white, which defeats the whole purpose. You want to create density not a whole other color or effect. But still, just amazing new medium. Now, I've mentioned before, my daughter's an artist. She does digital art on a tablet and kind of traditional with sketching and ink and paint. I've been trying to get her to do this, but she's one of those artists that likes to work alone. It's not something she likes to do spectator style, which I think is part of the kind of turnoff for her to try more of the tilt brush, because she was blown away. But again, I get the sense it would be something she would want in her own, work area studio. Next news piece, VentureBeat, an article about Linden Labs creation Sansar. Not going to drill into that too heavily. I've talked about it before, but if it's something you're interested in, I said when I would get more information on it, I'd let you guys know. Here is the link with exactly that. A ton of additional information on Sansar from Linden Labs. Just some ideas so you get to know what the article's about. They talk about the exploration, the socializing, the building, expressive avatars, text, voice. There's just an amazing cross-section of stuff that they discuss in this. Go check that out, link below. And guys, that's it for the news today. I said I was going to talk about the games and why I didn't put them up, and it wasn't just typical bad IT time estimating. The one game, and I'm not going to ruin that here, I'll mention that in the video, but there was one that really disappointed me, guys, and it was such a struggle to play through. It was one of those rare times where I think that first quick look, while okay, doesn't do the game justice that it deserves. And it's still a quick look at it, but it's a second quick look. Having that stuff in mind and trying to be a bit more constructive about it, but still getting my point across that, yeah, it ain't ready for prime time. So expect that, just a bit delayed. And same with the forums now that I'm officially on vacation. Cheers as always, guys. Have a kick-ass rest of the Monday. Check you on the VR flip side.